The Colt bucked in Sheriff Kane's hand, and the jailhouse erupted with thunder. Yellow lantern light flared, and the bullet struck the tall mercury glass opposite his desk. The pane spidered like winter ice, shards tinkling onto the plank floor, but his reflection did not shatter. It stood whole inside the fractured web. A man in a black hat, with steel gray eyes, his eyes staring back, with that cold, assessing calm he wore when he meant to kill. The echo rolled out the door into a desert night that smelled of creosote and rain far off. Dust floated in the lamplight like ash. A prisoner coughed in the back cell, just a ranch hand who'd drunk too deep, then went silent. Kane's badge spun slowly between his fingers, a silver coin catching fire in the lantern glow. The mirror's man did not spin his badge. He tilted his head and smiled. Kane's throat felt raw. "Who are you?" he said, voice low. "And what do you want with my name?" The reflection only breathed, then impossibly drew. Kane's Colt was already up. He stopped. Ricochets in a stone room kill fools and bystanders. The drunk snored. Somewhere a horse stamped. In the mirror, the other Kane lifted a gun with pearl grips that looked exactly like the one in Kane's hand, the one his wife had given him the year before she died. The smile on that face was narrow as a knife blade. The jail's front door banged, wind shouldering it inward. The lantern guttered. When the flame steadied, the reflection had rearranged. No gun now. Open hands, calm, contemptuous. Glass dust watched the floorboards like frost. Kane holstered the Colt, breath measured. He stepped closer until heat from the lantern warmed his cheek, and he could see tiny nick scars inside the larger scar that ran from jaw to neck. The mirror knew the map of his skin. The man in it leaned forward in perfect step, until their breath fogged the same chilled surface. "Law ain't always justice," Kane murmured, voice so soft it barely left his mouth. "But justice rides with me." In the broken silver, the other Kane's lips moved first. Lightning cracked somewhere beyond town, a dry whip. The drunk muttered and turned on his bunk. Kane reached out. His fingers touched cold. The reflection's hand hovered a hair's breadth from his. The sheriff closed his eyes once, hard enough to grind sand behind the lids. Then he turned from the mirror and kicked the door wide, letting the night pour in. 6 hours earlier, the town of Gray Butte had looked like it always did when heat stacked atop heat, until even flies moved drunk. The gallows on the courthouse lot cast 2 long legs of shadow, and a kid tossed pebbles at a tin can under its steps until his mother yanked him by the ear. A freight team rattled past the jail, boards shrieking, a slab of pink beef sweating under canvas. Smoke curled out the Arrowhead Saloon, whiskey and stale cards thick on the breath of the men playing Monte at the window. Kane's horse drank at the town trough. He stood with one boot on the lower rail, the leather of his duster creasing at the shoulder, hat brim low against the white scald of noon. He was listening, the way a man who'd lived long on other men's bad decisions learned to listen, while the blacksmith and the storekeeper pretended not to tell him something right beside his ear. "Payroll coach hit at Salt Draw last night," the smith said, tapping scale from his hammer, face ruddy with heat. 4 men, fast, precise. Leader wore a black hat. "Lots of black hats this side of the divide," Kane said. "Leader looked like you," the storekeeper whispered and glanced away. Kane waited. The town waited with him. Dust devils danced out past the livery like small, mean ghosts. They called him Kane. The smith added, swore it as they threw the strongbox. Folks talk, Sheriff. Folks always do. Kane flicked water from his fingers and didn't look at how they trembled. He could feel eyes on his back, like pins stuck into hide. The anxious, the vindictive, the relieved. All of them waiting to see whether their sheriff would shrug off murmurs that could bury a man. A preacher crossed the street, hat in his hands. "Brother Kane," he said, careful, "a thing's brewing. Men will be wanting to believe the worst of whoever stands closest to the gallows." Kane's jaw moved once. "Much obliged, Reverend." He made his rounds. The heat steadied the smell of old lye in the boardwalk and the sweet rot behind the butchers. At the abandoned courthouse, doors chained, windows boarded, since the county moved records down river. He paused and watched a shutter quiver in no wind. When he tested it, the wood came away in his hand. Inside, shadows stood in the cool, like men that had decided not to leave. Dust lay thick over benches where juries used to sit and pretend the law was blind. On the judge's desk he found a small square of mirror with its backing scorched black, as though someone had tried to burn a reflection out of it. He slid it into his pocket without knowing why. Back on Main, the whisper had grown legs. A woman tugged her child aside when Kane stepped from the apothecary. The old barber nodded and then didn't. By sundown, 3 cowhands at a faro table let it be heard that if a man wore a face like the law but robbed like the night, rope would save the county the cost of bullets. Kane heard it all and said nothing. When the wind turned and the first breath of storm pushed grit down the street, he went to his office and lit the lantern. He set his hat on its peg. The cells stood empty, save for the ranch hand who'd tried to outdrink his grief, now asleep, palm curled under his cheek like he was 12. Kane poured 2 fingers of rye he would not finish and placed it on the desk. The mirror above the gun rack was old and foxed, brought west by a dry goods man's wife, traded for a wagon wheel and a winter of protection. It had always made him look older and meaner. Tonight it made him look like a stranger. He drew because he had to prove something to himself about velocity and truth. The shot jumped out before thought attached to it. Glass broke. Reflection held. Now with the jail door open and the night invading in cool strips, Kane stepped onto the boardwalk. The storm smelt closer, sage, iron, cedar. He stood and let the wind comb the heat from his hair and listened again. A hammer clicked on metal, not his. Across the street, under the courthouse legs of shadow, 2 men were posting paper to the notice board by lantern flare. The light licked their badges, not town tin. U.S. Kane walked down into the dusty yellow pool and read his own name, spelled out with the care a clerk spends on a death list. Warrant of arrest, C. Kane, Sheriff, for murder, robbery at Salt Draw, the unlawful hanging of 1 Miles Torbet. Below the words, an inked likeness. His hat, his scar, his eyes rendered in tidy hatch lines that still managed to look cold and living. The taller marshal glanced at him without surprise, as if he'd been measuring this moment since noon. He was careful, handsome in a way practiced men can be, and his coat fell just right. The cloth not yet taught the language of dust. "Evening, Sheriff," he said, voice mild. "Name's Hollis Deacon, United States. You'll surrender your firearms." Kane looked at the paper, then at the gallows beyond, the hangman's beam black in the first flash of distant lightning. Behind him, in the jail, glass settled with a small crystalline sigh. "My office," he said, calm. "We speak there. No irons in my doorway." Deacon's partner, young, eager, with rain already beating his hat, shifted his weight, thumb near his gun thong. You forget your place, sir. You're the one wears irons now. Careful, Deacon murmured, eyes on Kane. We're here to keep the air cool. Kane studied their faces, weighed the angle of the street, the wind, the hour, the far footfalls he could hear but not see. His badge was heavy in his palm, and for a flicker he imagined setting it on the step and watching a boot heel crush the star. He didn't move. Miles Torbett, he said to the taller man, died under a cottonwood with a belly full of whiskey and 2 witnesses saying it was justice. I didn't hang him. Law says different. Deacon's smile did not reach his eyes. So do men I trust. Men you trust ever meet a mirror that lies? Deacon's brow ticked. You aiming to try that line in court? I'm aiming to find the man who wears my face. Kane said, you can help me do it, or you can hang the only soul hunting him. A gust ran down Main and slapped the wanted handbill flat to its nails. Somewhere behind Deacon, the Reverend's bell clanged once, hushed by the wind. The drunk in the cell coughed, and from the saloon came the brittle laughter of men who liked a show. Deacon lifted a palm, courteous and heavy as a judge's gavel. Inside then, he said, but you so much as twitch wrong, and my boy will cut you in half. They moved toward the jailhouse. The lantern's flame shivered as the 3 men crossed the threshold. The tall mirror waited, crazed with cracks, throwing back 3 versions of the same moment. As Kane stepped in, the other him stepped in too, late by the smallest fraction, and smiled. From the street came a single scream cut short, the kind of sound a town makes when the first drop of real blood hits new dust, then hoofbeats, sudden, fast, and far too many for a quiet night. Kane's hand hovered over his Colt. Marshal, he said without turning his head, you'll want to see this. What? Deacon asked. The answer arrived outside as 20 riders fanned into the square, lanterns flaring, guns black in their fists, and every face under those hats was Sheriff Kane's. For a heartbeat, the square looked like a bad dream hammered to life. 20 riders fanned wide, lanterns flaring, dust boiling around iron hooves. Each man wore a black hat, a long dark duster, a strip of leather across the jaw to mimic a scar. In that wavering light, they all looked like Sheriff Kane riding toward his own front door. Marshal Hollis Deacon didn't blink. His young partner did. The boy's breath hissed between teeth. By thunder. Hold your fire, Deacon said softly, as if he didn't want to scuff the air. The riders didn't shoot. They let the town drink the picture. Then their leader, Kane's height, Kane's hat, a pearl-gripped Colt, tilted his chin toward the gallows and laughed, a bright, hard sound that cut like tin. "Evenin', Sheriff," he called. "Fine noose you keep ready. Might fit you just right." Kane stepped into the doorway so the lantern painted him plain. "You're borrowing a face that can't save you." The big Colt spun in the leader's hand like a coin. "Who says I want saving?" A crack of lightning stitched the sky. The gang wheeled as one and poured south down Main, hooves striking sparks. A breath later came the ripping chorus of gunfire from the direction of the bank, the heavy, hungry kind that ate wood and men. Kane didn't move. Deacon watched him not move. "I was in your sight line," Kane said. Deacon's mouth made a shape like a smile, and didn't finish it. "So you were." They went together. Kane, Deacon, the boy, running hard into dust that tasted of copper. In the bank's vestibule, the safe stood open like a kicked jaw. The teller moaned on the floor, hat knocked sideways, blood black in the lamplight. A woman held her own wrist bones together and tried to pray. On the counter lay a calling card nobody wanted, an inked likeness of Sheriff Kane, cut from a broadside and stabbed to the wood with a sliver of mirror. Kane palmed the shard. Its backing was scorched. The quicksilver bubbled as if someone had tried to cook the truth out of it. He slid it into the pocket with the square he'd found in the abandoned courthouse and felt the cold bite through cloth. Outside, men spilled from the Arrowhead Saloon in a low, angry tide. The barber said, "Knew it," and the grocer's wife said, "God help us," and a cowboy spat and muttered, "Hang him quick and sort the sermon later." The Reverend hovered on the church steps, with rain beating his collar and fear beating his lip. The gallows creaked in the wind, as if the noose were already remembering names. Deacon moved his badge a half-inch so it caught light. "Sheriff Kane, for the peace of Grey Butte and the safety of citizens, you'll remain in my custody while we inquire." Kane looked at the people whose taxes bought rope. He saw relief in some eyes, hunger in others. He touched the star on his chest, felt its edges like a thorn under skin. "All right," he said. The word felt like swallowing a nail. "Inquiry needs a hunter. I'll ride on a short leash." Deacon nodded once. "Short." They bedded the groaning teller with laudanum and left the deputy and the preacher to pray over the splinters. Wind kicked grit down the alley behind the photographer's shack. Fitch and Son, Daguerrean, Portraits and Views, where a shutter rattled on a loose nail. A chemical reek hung there. Ether, collodion, silver nitrate. On a packing crate, someone had stenciled mercury glass, handle with Providence, the misspelling done by a man who didn't read enough to lie well on paper. Kane rapped. A thin man with lenses thick as coins opened, peering like a mole hauled into daylight. His fingers shook. Studios closed. "Not for the law," Deacon said pleasantly. Fitch's eyes landed on Kane and stuck there. "Oh," he said, small as a pinhead. The studio breathed chemicals and harsh white light. Along one wall, wet plates leaned like black rain against racks. On a table, a row of crude half-masks cut from leather, jaw slits marked with a thin line meant to imitate a scar. Beside them, a pearl grip someone had dipped in paint to learn its color. Deacon's brows went up. "Making theatricals, Mr. Fitch?" Fitch tried to smile. "Carnival coming through. Folks like a shiver. I sell novelty." Kane picked up a mask. It smelled of glue and fear. "Who purchased 20 of these?" Fitch swallowed so loudly the boy winced. "An agent. Never gave a name. Paid in gold eagles. Had a wagon with sideboards painted Latham & Co. Glass, mirrors, fine optics." The name skittered through Kane's mind like a lizard, leaving only the ripple. Said he needed them for a tableau show, pageant. He had a list of measurements: hat circumference, shoulder span, wrist. He knew yours, Sheriff. Fitch's eyes slid to the scar that cut Kane's jaw. He knew that. Deacon took the list. Fitch fumbled from a drawer. The paper crackled like dry leaves. "Who sent you the empty mercury crates?" "Those?" Fitch shrugged too quick. "I refit old mirrors sometimes. Gave up glass for faces months back. Harder to work with than wet plates. People don't sit still." Kane set the mask down slow. "Men do." Fitch's hands began to flutter. "Listen, I don't want trouble. I just sell light caught in boxes." "You sold faces," Kane said. "That's worse." Rain ticked the window, stingy at first, then a steady rat-tat. Deacon folded the list tight, tucked it into his coat, like a verdict. "We're done here, Mr. Fitch. If you think of the agent's name, Fetch me quick." They stepped back under the awning. The rain turned the street to a dark seam stitched with pale foam. In that gray veil, the town's whispers traveled farther. "Sheriff's gang," someone said. "Sheriff's hand," another insisted. "Sheriff's rope," a third muttered, eyeing the gallows. Kane's deputy, Lyle Finch, a compact man with careful boots and a mouth that always seemed to be rehearsing apologies, found them at the boardwalk's end. His hat dripped. His eyes didn't quite meet Kane's. "You all right, Sheriff?" "Do I look all right?" Kane asked without heat. Finch's glance snagged on the cut masks Deacon carried in a sack. When he spoke, he aimed it past Kane at Deacon. "We got a problem by the freight office. A body. Folks say you ought to see." They pushed through a knot of men and one sobbing girl to the freight shed. The air smelled of damp burlap and mule. A man lay on a pallet, the life in him gone. Rain dented his hair in little commas. His hands were bound with twine, wrists blued. On his chest, pinned with a stiletto of mirror, lay a sign carefully inked. "Justice by Kane." Beside his head a second sign, smaller. "Hang yourself. Save them." Kane recognized the jaw before he let himself know the eyes. Miles Torbett. The man he hadn't hanged 2 nights back, because a judge's paper had been dirty, and the witnesses dirtier. Torbett had bragged he'd be standing at the bar this week, because money traveled faster than guilt. Now he was dead, and his corpse told a story that could not be unwritten. Deacon crouched. The sign's edges bled silver where the mirror sliver cut the wood. He looked up. "You still not hanging men, Sheriff?" "Not with another man's rope," Kane said. He could feel rain sneaking down the back of his collar like a cold finger. The boy marshal pointed at the freight cart. A smear of black marked the rail. He rubbed it and sniffed. "Soot." "Someone burned glass," the boy said, puzzled. "Why burn a mirror?" "To fry the memory out," Kane muttered. The square of scorched silver in his pocket felt heavier by the breath. "Or to teach it to lie." They stood in that box of quiet, while the town built its gallows of words outside. Kane studied Finch without looking straight at him. The deputy's hands were raw across the palms. New cuts, the kind you get when you snatch at something sharp. A smear of the same fine soot darkened the cuff of his coat. Finch noticed Kane noticing and slid the cuff down, almost neat. "Your hands," Kane said. Finch glanced at his skin like he'd forgotten he wore it. "Rope burn from the drunks last night." "We didn't have drunks last night," Kane said softly. The boy marshal shifted. Deacon's eyes flicked and filed the detail. A thunderhead rolled its shoulder and dropped the first cold sheet of real rain. The gallows groaned. Somewhere near the church a dog howled once, then decided the weather was a better enemy than men and went quiet. Kane leaned his knuckles on the freight table and let the water pepper his hat brim. The mirror sliver on Torbett's chest caught a slash of lightning and flashed, a wink from bad heaven. "Here's your choice," Deacon said, the rain pattering in his voice. "I clap you in irons, and the town sleeps easier for one night. Or you walk with me under watch, and we hunt men who make masks of other men." He looked toward the gallows. "But understand me. The rope's already argued your case, and the rope is persuasive." Kane turned the star in his fingers until it cut, then set it against wet wood and let it spin once. It whirled, stuttered, stopped, one point aimed at the courthouse like a compass that had been taught a single direction. "Law ain't always justice," he said, almost to the rain, "but justice rides with me." Deacon nodded. Then it'll have 2 horses. Finch cleared his throat. Sheriff, there's more. His eyes finally climbed the long hill to meet Kane's, and what lay in them wasn't apology anymore. It was dread. A boy came to the jail while you were at the bank. Says he saw you ride out to North Mesa. Says you took the Reverend's niece with a rope around her wrists. Kane felt something in his chest grab hold and pull. The Reverend's niece, the Apache girl the circuit preacher had taken in for the winter, small, proud, eyes that didn't ask for pity. Rain thudded louder on the freight roof like the sky had started pounding a drum. "Which way?" Kane asked. Finch pointed with the hand he'd hidden. The cut across his palm split open in the wet and left a thin red line. "North," he said, toward the old courthouse road. The church bell began to ring then, wild and wrong, not the clean count of hours, but a frantic clanging that made the hair on Kane's arms lift. It was the sound towns make when a rope moves in stormlight. They turned as one toward the square and saw the gallows lantern flare up to a hard white. A shape swung there in the rain, small, barefoot, wrists bound, a leather strip at the jaw to mimic a scar. Pinned to her dress with a shard of scorched mirror, the sign read, "Hang the sheriff by dawn, or the child hangs for him." Rain sheeted across the square, drumming on boards, flattening dust to black paste. The gallows lantern flared white, and there she hung, small feet bare, skirts plastered to thin shins, wrists bound, a thin strip of leather strapped along her jaw to mimic a scar. A shard of scorched mirror pinned a sign to her dress, "Hang the sheriff by dawn, or the child hangs for him." Kane moved before the crowd could think for him. Deacon moved with him, coat snapping, badge bright with rain. The young marshal kicked the ladder out from the gallows, jammed it back under with his shoulder, and braced. "Up you go," he hissed. Kane climbed hard. The noose was cinched, ugly and practiced, but the knot hadn't been yanked shut. A performance knot, cruel but careful. He palmed the line, relieved pressure, slid the loop, and felt the girl's weight ease against his forearm. "Hold, Sheriff," Deacon called, steady as a judge. "Easy now." He slipped the loop off and swung her into his arms. She weighed near nothing. When he pulled away the leather strip, her face shone pale and furious in the lantern glow. Nita, the Reverend's niece, the Apache girl with a stare like flint. Her voice came thin, torn by rope. "Not you," she whispered, gripping his duster. "Not your smell. Glass men, they wore your eyes." "Water," Kane said, already climbing down. The square erupted in 2 voices at once. The first voice was relief. A scattering of prayers rattled off with shaking hands. The second voice was meaner and louder, and carried by men who liked the taste of fear. "That sign said dawn," someone shouted under the Arrowhead's awning. "Town's got till sunup. Best make it easy." A big rancher pushed through with a length of lariat wrapped across his chest, like a sash. His hat dripped, his mouth grinned. "Citizens, arrest," he declared. "We string the sheriff now and beat the clock." Deacon faced him, rain purling on his lashes, voice mild as clean linen. "You'll holster that rope, friend. By the authority of the United States, there'll be no hanging without paper." "Paper?" the rancher spat. "Paper got us robbed. Paper got that killer back on the street." He jabbed a finger at Kane. "He looks like the man that hung my brother last winter, face and all." "He looks like the law," the Reverend said, shoving his way in, collar soaked flat, eyes glassy with terror and fury. He pulled Nita into his arms and flinched at the rope burn circling her neck. He looks like the only one who had her in his hands and didn't let her die. The rancher sneered. "Preacher talk." The crowd surged, then steadied when Deacon's hand lifted, not to his gun, just to that badge, a quiet, heavy gesture. Kane stood in the rain, duster dripping, star cold against his palm. "You hang me, the glass men ride off laughing, and your children are their next paper," he said. "I hang, and there's no one left hunting your ghosts. You ready to bet on that?" A hard-faced storekeeper nodded toward Nita, lips thin with rage. "And what do we bet if we don't hang you? That they won't come back and finish the job? Then we meet them at the door," Deacon said. He pitched his voice so it traveled. "By thunder, this square is under federal protection till sunup. Any man who pulls a trigger without my say will spend what's left of this life memorizing the inside of a cell." "Whose cell?" someone jeered. "His?" Laughter scattered like buckshot. The young marshal's gun hand twitched. Deacon didn't blink. He took Nita's chin, gentle. What did they call each other? She swallowed, winced. Rain beaded the line of burn at her throat. Didn't. They tapped. 2 taps for left, 1 for right. Rode like they'd practiced it on a long street with nobody watching. Her fingers tightened in Kane's coat, looking for something like bone to hold. They put a cloth that smelled like flowers and frogs over my mouth. I woke to boards under me and a sound, like coins in a jar. Kane's head lifted, coins in a jar, mercury glass humming in its sickness. He remembered the square of scorched mirror in his pocket, the chemical stink at Fitch's, the crates marked Latham & Co. Glass, mirrors, fine optics. He looked at Deputy Finch. Finch's hat brim shivered in the rain. His eyes didn't quite hold. Across his cuff, that faint dusting of soot Kane had seen at the freight shed, smiled up like a bad joke. The deputy forced a grin that showed too many teeth. "We should get her to the doctor, Sheriff." "We will," Kane said. He passed Nita to the Reverend. "Pad the burn with wet cloth. Keep her head up." He glanced at Deacon. "Your boy can walk her." "I'm not," the young marshal began. "You are," Deacon said without looking away from Kane. "Easy as carrying a Bible." They set off toward the apothecary through rain and whispers. The crowd continued splitting along invisible seams, merchants tightening shutters, cowhands lingering at corners with thumbs hooked to holsters, women hauling children indoors with furious tenderness. The bell tolled again, softer now, as though tired of its own panic. Inside the jail, lamplight wove gold into the storm's dull iron. Water ticked from Kane's hat onto the plank floor. The cracked mirror over the rack held 3 wet men, each with his own kind of ruin hanging off him. Kane took the 2 mirror shards from his pocket, set them on the desk, backings scorched, edges jagged, silver peeling like a snake that wanted a new skin. Deacon leaned over, hands on the desk's edge. "You're thinking symbols, not men." "I'm thinking men who hide in symbols," Kane said. He slid 1 shard across the other. Reflections multiplied, eyes on eyes, hats on hats, until every broken angle made him into someone else. In the mess of light, letters caught, Q-R-T. He stopped, shifted again, courthouse, split across the fracture, the 2 halves only aligning when the silver lay exactly wrong. "Abandoned courthouse," Deacon said. Kane nodded once. The rain hammered approval. They rehearsed there, mirrors for sightlines, masks for faces, rope for practice. "You sure?" Finch said, and his voice cracked like bad wood. He jammed his hands into his coat pockets, hiding the raw red along his palms. Kane looked at him the way a wolf looks at brush when brush has begun to breathe. "You'll come." Finch's mouth opened and closed. "Sure, Sheriff. Wherever you say." They stepped back to the threshold. The square had transformed into a line of small wars, men arguing on porches, women knotting shawls, boys turned into runners, carrying fear between doors. The gallows loomed center like a black grammar mark in a sentence nobody wanted to read aloud. The sign the gang had pinned, "Hang the Sheriff by dawn," flapped and smacked the post like it was practicing. Every gust slapped it harder. A barrel-chested man in a dry coat strode through the downpour as if he owned rain. Caldwell, the bank president, hat immaculate, voice clipped as shears. "Marshal Deacon, the committee has conferred. We will turn the sheriff over at first light to satisfy the demand." Deacon tilted his head. "What committee?" "Men with property and skin in the game," Caldwell said. "We can't have a mob, so we'll have order." He smiled, prim and cold. "We'll write it out nice." "Write whatever you like," Deacon replied, pleasant as a parlor. "It won't hang a man under my watch." Caldwell's eyes went flat. "Federal or not, this is a town. We'll mind our own." "You haven't minded it well," the Reverend said quietly, appearing at Caldwell's elbow like a ghost in a wet collar. His voice shook. "You minded your ledger, while wolves dressed as men studied our children." Caldwell's jaw worked, a tick of anger in a careful face. He turned on his heel, coat shedding water like a duck, and vanished into the saloon's shelter. Men followed him, drawn to warmth and the illusion of plans. "Authorities splitting," Deacon murmured. "We've got hours." "Less," Kane said. He thumbed the star on his chest until it bit. "Dawn's quicker than truth." They left the boy marshal at the apothecary door, posted 2 town men at the jail who still believed badges meant something, and cut north up the alley that stank of lie and mule. The rain eased to a fine wire hiss. Past Fitch's, the chemical reek clung to the damp like a bad memory. Past the freight office, a pool of lamplight flickered behind a torn blind. Someone watching, not daring to learn. They reached the old courthouse road as lightning stitched blue through the low clouds and threw the ruin into sharp relief. The place sat on its rise like a skull with its eyes put out. Windows boarded, door chained, the judge's balcony sagging like a lip. On the porch rail, someone had tied a ribbon of leather, the exact color of the strip they'd pulled from Nita's jaw. It flapped in the night, tapping the wood with a sound like someone counting. 2 taps. 1, 2, 1. "Glass men," Kane said. Deacon's hand lowered to his gun, not drawing, just remembering. "We go in quiet." Finch lagged a step, boots whispering water. Maybe we wait for daylight." "Dawn belongs to the rope," Kane said. He bent at the chain, tested its play. The metal sang that thin, bright note guilty locks sing. From inside, beyond the boards and chains, a sound rose. Not voices, not steps. The soft, uncanny clink of mirrored panes knocked gently together, like coins turning in a jar you couldn't quite open. Kane looked at Deacon. Deacon looked at Kane. The rain hushed as if the weather wanted to hear what came next. Kane lifted the lantern and set its flame near the seam where the doors met. On the other side, the mirrors sang again, and then a voice that sounded exactly like his said, through wood and wet and night, "Come in, Sheriff. Court's in session." The old courthouse crouched on the hill like a buzzard at roost, its windows black as missing teeth, its clapboards silvered by years of wind. Kane climbed the cracked steps with a lantern in one hand and his Colty loose as in the other. Somewhere below, The town's last lights guttered in the wind, and the gallows beam behind the courthouse let out a long, dry groan that settled under his skin like a splinter. He paused, felt the night breathe, and then shouldered the door. Dust leapt in the lantern's glow. Paper curled in open drawers. Damp rot laced the air with sweetness turned sour. The badge on his chest winked and vanished as he moved. "You ain't a home for justice anymore," he muttered to the empty hall, voice low, steady. His boot scuffed a fallen placard, Territorial Court, Hono Hollis Cobb, before it flipped and skated away. The lobby opened into the courtroom, pews like broken ribs, judge's bench looming like a black altar. Kane's eyes mapped exits out of habit, the side door to chambers, a door under the stairs, the double doors behind him. He closed the double doors and slid the iron bolt. Wind hissed against the frame and slipped away. He breathed in the building's memory. Ink, oak, the cold iron tang of shackles, and something else. Bay rum, faint as a ghost, fresh as tonight. He let the lantern ride the rail of the jury box and paced slow. On the floorboards near counsel's table, a thread of glitter caught the light. He crouched. Glass, thin, heavy, a shard of plate, the edge beveled fancy. He turned it, and the lantern threw fire along the cut, like a river at sunset. His shot at the mirror flashed back in his mind, the way the reflection had stood, chin tilted, unblinking even when his bullet cracked. He'd blamed the whiskey. Now he wasn't so sure. Kane stood and crossed to the bench. A paneled wall there promised secrets. He rapped it with his knuckles, hollow. He felt along the molding until a sliver of wood gave beneath his thumb. The panel sighed open on rusted hinges, revealing a narrow alcove behind the judge's seat. A rectangle of glass still clung in a brace, clear when viewed straight on, silvering when the lantern slid aside. A viewing window, a trick mirror. "Pepper's ghost," he murmured, thinking of traveling shows he'd seen as a drifter, how men had played at phantoms with angled glass and oil lamp light. He touched the glass. Powder from a recent polishing came away on his finger. He wasn't alone. A faint clink brought his head up. Not wind, not building, iron. He eased the Colt from his holster, thumbed the hammer back until it lipped soft as breath. "Sheriff?" a voice whispered, dry as paper, from beneath the floor. Kane pivoted, lantern sweeping. The sound had come from near the clerk's rail. He moved to it, found a trap frame sunk flush with the floorboards. The iron ring was tucked under dust like a buried coin. He wedged the ring with his belt knife and heaved. The hatch came up an inch and stuck. He put his shoulder into it. Wood shrieked, then yielded. The smell that came out was wet stone and fear. In the crawlspace crouched a girl, maybe 16, her hair in 2 rough braids, wrists raw from rope. Even in the lantern's dim she held herself proud, chin up. Apache. She flinched from the light, then stared like she recognized his face from a bad dream. "You're him," she said, "or the other you." Kane holstered his gun one-handed, said the other lowering. He kept his voice the kind a skittish horse would heed. "Name?" "Nita," she said. "He put me here, said if I talked." She swallowed, eyes flicking to the gallows shadow bleeding through the window. "He smells like bay rum. He wears your coat." His jaw tightened. "Left-handed?" She nodded, quick. "He draws wrong. Fast, but wrong." Kane cut her ties and eased her out, noting the marks. He saw where a heavy ring had bitten her arm. The link still hung from a shackle on the wall. He palmed it and felt the stamp, a small star with one bent point. He'd seen that maker's mark on irons ordered by the territorial marshal's office. He felt a cold line draw itself behind his scar. Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me, he said, quiet, and the decision settled like iron. By statute, he ought to march Nita to the jail and book her as material witness. By conscience, he'd get her out before the double used her again. We go through chambers. Stay on my boot heels. No sound. They moved, lantern hooded, the courthouse alive around them with every groan of timber. In the judge's chamber, a ledger lay open beneath a rain-warped window. Kane set the lantern down, and the page leapt bright. Payments neat as fence posts marching across the paper. The first entries were years old. Jury fees, postage, a jar of nails. Then fresh ink, tidy and false. Special services, JR, over and over. Sums too fat for honest work. Another page, glass, stage, Phantasmagoria Co., San Marcos, paid. He flipped again. Clothing, black duster, hat size, 712, paid. Colt grips, bone, paid. His finger stopped. The next line read, mirrored frame, bench install, paid. A boot scuffed in the hall. Kane doused the lantern. Darkness came down like a curtain. The court held its breath. He could hear Nita's pulse in her throat. He tasted dust. The scuff sounded again, deliberate, measured. A man used to having time. The doorknob turned. Kane's Colt was a shadow extension of his hand. Much obliged if you don't try that, he said, voice almost pleasant. A dry chuckle drifted through the wood. It was his own laugh, thrown back at him wrong. Evening, Sheriff, said his voice from the hall. The door stayed closed. You found my paper. You going to arrest a ledger? Show yourself, Kane said. No, the voice said, and glass shattered somewhere down the corridor. Fire licked the air a moment later, sharp lamp oil, guttering wild. The courthouse seemed to inhale, dry boards waking to flame. Kane lit the lantern, grabbed the ledger, and stuffed it inside his coat. Move, he told Nita, and pushed into the corridor. Smoke rolled along the ceiling like a thing with a mind. The far end glowed orange. The double had set the place like a kiln. They sprinted for the double doors. The iron bolt he'd slid now ran hot under his palm. He kicked it free. Wind roared in and the fire bent and snapped like a tethered beast smelling open country. As they hit the porch, a rifle cracked from the yard. Splinters bit his cheek. Kane shoved Nita behind the rail and threw himself flat. He placed the shooter by sound, left of the gallows, low, behind the judge's rain barrel. He popped, fired two, saw a shape flinch in the firelight. The answering shot punched the post near his ear and sang away into night. Another smell came in that second, bay rum, clear as a hand on his shoulder. The man was closer than the rifle, upwind, near the steps. Nita hissed, "Under," and darted for the shadows. Kane caught her arm. "No farther." She jerked her chin toward the gallows. "Trap lever," she whispered. "He said he wanted to hear you drop. Like a sermon." Kane's stomach turned the way a colt turns at a snake. He rolled to a knee, fire brightening his pearl grips, and crawled low off the porch. The gallows rose over him, crossbeam black against the stars, rope a pale question mark hanging down. Beneath the platform he saw the lever, the old iron dog that tripped the door, and he saw the line the double had strung from the lever up through the joists, cowhide, thin as a vein, routed through a window into the courtroom's ceiling. He understood. When he'd opened the hidden panel, When he'd dragged the hatch, he'd set his own gallows. Somewhere, the other him had been waiting to pull. "Smart," he called into the heat, not bothering to hide his admiration. The fire answered with a new crack, window glass failing as heat found it. The courthouse flung embers like handfuls of stars. "Smarter than you," his voice came back, lazy as high noon. The words slid out from behind the judge's bench window, where the glass still made tricks. "Town'll see the courthouse burn. Town'll see the sheriff run from it with stolen books and an Indian girl. Not much of a trial needed." Kane looked at Nita. Smoke painted her cheek like war paint. "Go," he said. "Past the cottonwoods. Follow the ditch line south to the river. Take the dark. Don't look back." "I won't leave." "That's the law," he said. "My law." She held his gaze, then nodded and melted into shadow. A small, soundless ghost. He stood. He holstered the Colt, then did something the other him wouldn't expect. He climbed the gallows steps slow, boots hollow on the planks. At the top he uncoiled the rope and weighed it in his hands. The hemp was stiff, tar-sour, slick with old use. He looked across the flaming court and imagined the angle of the line through the ceiling, the measured cruelty of a man who liked the creak of a body falling. He set the noose over the beam and stepped forward until it brushed his shoulder like a cold finger. "Come on then," he called. "If you're me, hang me clean." Silence pressed close. Fire threw light in cobwebbed skeins across the yard. The mirror behind the bench flickered and held. A shape stood there, his hat, his coat, his posture borrowed and near perfect. The head tilted, appraising. Even at distance, Kane could feel the grin. "Lawman," the double said, the word fond as a pet name. "You always did prefer a fair swing." A small sound clicked behind Kane's heel. He didn't have time to place it. The gallows lever snapped down, iron screaming, and the drop door blew out from under him. Kane's boots found nothing. The noose kissed his throat as he fell. The rope went tight, and he caught the beam with one desperate hand, fingers skidding on creosote as the strand rasped across his skin. Pain flared white. The world narrowed to the scrape of his gloves and the drum of his heart. Below, the fire reached the steps and ran up like spilled sun. On the far side of the yard, a gun cocked, gentle, intimate. The other him watched from the judge's window, light gilding his stolen face. "Justice rides with me," that borrowed voice whispered in Kane's tone. Kane hung between sky and flame, boots scything air, the noose sawing at his neck, his badge spinning at his chest. And as the rope tightened another inch, the mirror on the bench flashed, once, revealing the shadow of the hand that held the glass from behind, and a bone-white grip that wasn't pearl at all. Wind combed Main Street like a mean hand through brittle hair. The jailhouse lamp threw thin bars of light across the floorboards, and Sheriff Kane stood inside those bars, eyes on the ledger he'd brought back from the abandoned courthouse. The paper smelled of damp wood and old ink. Names marched in neat columns, amounts beside them, every payment a quiet betrayal. At the bottom ran a tidy initialing, EF, repeated like a nailhead tapped flat. Eli Finch, his own deputy. He let the ledger shut with a whisper. On the peg by the door, his duster hung heavy with trail grit. His silver badge spun between his fingers, light skating over its star points. Behind him, the cells murmured with the usual late-night breath. Snoring, a cough, an oath mumbled into straw. Outside, a downwind bell clanged twice, the blacksmith's practice swing before bed. ordinary sounds. But there was a wrongness in the air, dry and electric, the way air gathers itself an instant before lightning. Bootsteps approached. Kane slid the ledger into his desk drawer and palmed the key. The door opened with a soft scrape, and Finch filled the frame. Hat low, frock coat dark with winter dust, rain-speckled mustache tugged into a tired smile. "You look like hell, Sheriff," he said, shutting the night behind him. His voice was too easy, too careful. "Town's high-strung. Hollis says the council wants you to call a curfew." Kane studied him. Finch's hands rested where a man's hands belong when he comes to his own office, away from his gun. There were details, though. The faint smell of chimney soot clinging to him, a smear on the cuff the color of burned oil, and the way his eyes kept skipping to the desk drawer like a moth charms itself to a lamp. "Council can wait." Kane's voice came slow. He set the badge down, stood very still. "How late were you at the courthouse tonight?" Finch blinked, too fast, just long enough to find rats with better manners than lawyers. He laughed and didn't look at the drawer. "Why?" Kane stepped closer until he could see his own thin outline reflected in Finch's pupils. "Because I fired into a mirror and watched a ghost refuse to die." He let the words hang, felt the room prick with attention. The old wall clock ticked its nickel tongue. And because someone cut a hole behind the judge's glass, backed it with a stove plate, and used it to draw a shadow that wears my coat. Finch's smile thinned. "That's a story for the saloon. And this is a number for the gallows." Kane lifted his hand, thumb rubbing the ledger's key tucked warm in his palm. "Payments, over months, for cattle votes, for whispers in court, for a man who looks like me and kills in alleys, all signed E.F. The deputy's jaw worked. He laughed again, but it came out with a rattle. E.F. could be Eli Franklin, Enoch Fields, could be anybody. "Could be," Kane said. He reached back, turned the lamp wick with a hiss. Shadows slid, climbed Finch's cheekbones like black water. "Except I found your boot heel mark in the courthouse dust, inside the judge's closet. You favor the left when you're tired. Most men don't print that deep on one side." For a heartbeat, Finch stood quiet, wind tapping at the window like an impatient creditor. Then he did something small and human. He swallowed. Kane saw the ripple in his throat. He had him. Finch's gaze dropped to the spinning badge, to the lamp, to the drawer with the ledger key. Then he lifted his eyes and gave up, pretending. "You're too good at this, Kane." Kane waited. Finch's shoulders lowered a fraction, the mask sliding off his face like snow off a roof. What looked back at the sheriff was older than the man he knew, hollowed with want and late nights. "Hollis is selling this town by inches," he said, voice flat now. "Rail spur, land guarantees, freight contracts. He needed a devil, somebody folks would fear enough to vote security money, jail expansions, private guards. Your doppelgänger is worth 1,000 sermons." "And you?" Kane asked. "I needed out." Finch's mouth twitched, a bitter half-smile. "Debt's bad, Sheriff. Worse than bullets. A man starts paying it with pieces of himself. Hollis covered a loan I couldn't carry. All I owed him was a small thing. Leave the back door open, move a mirror, let a stranger wear a hat." In the cells, someone stirred straw and muttered for whiskey. Far down the street, a piano gave a single blind plonk and fell quiet. "Name the stranger," Kane said. Finch hesitated. "Rafe Cutter, ex-cavalry scout, same height as you, same shoulders. He rides under your hat like it was born there. Hollis got him thinking you shot his brother up on the Mimbres. That brother died to fever, but truth don't matter if a lie pays better. Kane felt something old and iron-cold climbing his spine. Cutter, the name, slid through his memory like a snake through grass. Glimpses of campfires and a long-ago campaign where men learned to read death by smell. Where is he? Finch's eyes flicked, involuntary, toward the window, the street. Saloon attic until midnight. Then he rides to the water tower. Folks will see him there, framed clean against the moon. He fires into the empty yard and drops your pearl-handled Colt. All anyone will remember is the star on his chest. My Colt is on my hip, Kane said softly. Finch's mouth opened, shut. He understood. Somewhere in town, the twin to that Colt waited to be recovered from a staged crime. The net was nearly closed. You could have told me. Kane's voice picked up gravel. Instead, you sold me to a mirror. Finch's gaze flared with anger that wasn't quite shame. You wear the badge like scripture, Kane. Not all of us can afford faith. Wind shoved the door in its frame. The lamp flickered. Somewhere beyond the jail, hooves clattered hard, riders coming too fast for respectable business. In the same breath, a smell of smoke snuck under the door, thin but sharp as a struck match. Kane moved without thinking. He yanked open the drawer, claimed the ledger, slammed it into his duster. Unlock the cells, he said. Now. Finch hovered. You're freeing prisoners? I'm keeping men from burning alive. Kane's stare cut like a chisel. We do law later. Finch hesitated too long. Kane reached behind, snatched the ring of keys from the hook, and shouldered past him. Iron grated. Locks clacked open. Faces lifted. Pale, surprised. Some with hope, like a dog that's been kicked and still wants to trust. Out the back, Kane ordered. One at a time, hands high. You cut across the creek and stay away from trouble. You'll find me. Try me, and I won't need a mirror to put you down. He hooked the last lock, shoved the final man toward the rear door. Flame jumped in the glass, orange, finding the lamp like a lover. The jailhouse roof groaned as heat ate dry pine. Smoke coiled along the ceiling, sweet with pitch and old varnish. Finch backed toward the window, hand hovering a hair over his pistol, and then away, then back again. Who struck the spark? Kane asked, eyes watering, voice steady. Finch shook his head. Hollis's boys. They were supposed to scare you, make you run into Cutter's arms. I told them fire was a fool's tool. They never listen. The front window blew inward with a searing bloom, hot wind shoving ash across the floor. Outside, voices jeered. Hang the ghost. Hang the devil who wears a badge. Kane stepped into Finch's space, close enough to smell the throat sting of char and the sour of fear. You can still choose, he said. Open the side door, get the injured out. Stand with me on the boards when the crowd rushes. Or you can climb out the back and let Cutter make a legend out of my corpse. Finch stared at him, a map of want and want of courage on his face. They'll tear you to pieces. Maybe, Kane said. He pulled the duster on, felt the ledger's weight against his ribs, the badge cool against his breastbone. But the town will see who lights fires and who drags men from them. Outside, the crowd swelled, boots, fists, a saw-voiced chant. Above the noise came something smaller, a child's wail, high and thin, from the boarding house across the alley. Kane's chest went cold. The alley would chimney the heat. Flame would run plank to plank, leap to dry shingles, crawl down to crib slats like a red animal. Finch heard it too. He flinched. Hell! Kane turned toward the side door. The choice rose before him, clean and terrible. Leap to the boarding house and pull a baby from smoke. Justice owed to the living, or hold ground at the front, show the mob his face under the hat, and gamble that truth could still be taught to a crowd. His palm lay on the latch. He felt the old scar on his jaw pull a little as his mouth hardened. Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me, he said, the line low as a prayer and final as a verdict. He looked at Finch once more. With me? Kane said. Not a request. The deputy's gaze flicked between front and side, between the silver star and the red flare at the window, between a man he'd betrayed and the child whose cry was thinning. And then Finch moved, left hand finding the bolt, right hand shoving the side door open to the alley's furnace breath. Go, he rasped, the word scraped raw. I'll take the front. Kane didn't wait to read the finer print in Finch's face. He plunged into the alley heat, hat brim low, smoke clawing at his eyes, boots sliding on ash. Boards popped, sparks hissed on his coat. The boarding house steps glowed like coals. He hit the porch with his shoulder, splintered the latch, and old pine gave way with a howl. Behind him, from the jailhouse mouth, rose a gunshot, one, then two, and screams that could have been fear or could have been rage. Kane took the stairs, 3 at a time, smoke closing like a fist, the child's cry, a thread he grasped with both hands. The hallway turned to tunnel, floor hot through his soles. He slammed into the last door, wood buckling and saw, through a room of smoke and orange, an infant crib haloed by flying cinders, and a shadow beyond the window, broad hat, black duster, watching him through the rippling heat with a smile that was not his. Rafe Cutter lifted a finger to his brim in a mock salute and vanished into the firelight. Kane stepped into the room and the floor cracked under him with a sound like rope tightening. The house shuddered. Somewhere below, the crowd howled. And from the jailhouse, a new voice, Finch's, shouted Kane's name like a warning and a plea combined, right as something heavy struck the front doors and the gallows bell began to toll. Wind moaned through the broken shutters of the abandoned courthouse, like a jury whispering its verdict. Moonlight laid a pale blade across the warped floorboards, and dust hung in the air like old guilt. Sheriff Kane stepped through the doorway, duster whispering at his boots, silver badge winking once on his chest before the dark swallowed it whole. The rope of the long-disused gallows outside creaked as if it still remembered necks. He stopped when the lamplight flared. Another man stood behind the judge's rail with a lamp in one hand and a pearl-handled Colt in the other. A man with Kane's height, Kane's hat, the same cold steel eyes, the faint white scar along the jaw. The copy's badge had the same star and stamp. Only the smile was wrong. It wasn't in the face, it was in the soul. Between them, chained to the witness chair with iron cuffs biting raw into her wrists, the Apache girl sat rigid and proud. She'd warned him in a dry whisper 2 hours ago. Someone wore his face in the night streets, collecting debts only a devil would call due. Now her chin lifted toward him as if the light itself might cut those chains. "Evening, Sheriff," the other Kane drawled, voice as familiar as a memory and twice as cruel. "You came. Much obliged." Kane's hand hovered near his holster. "Name. Names are masks." The echo, Kane's own timbre thrown through a pane of glass, rang weirdly in the hollow room. "But for the record, you can call me Mr. Crow. Most men don't live long enough to use it twice. Something shifted in the shadows near the clerk's table. Deputy Harlan Pike, the same deputy who'd smiled too quickly and lied too slowly in Kane's office yesterday, stepped into the lamplight carrying a ledger bound in cracked brown leather. Sweat slicked his hair to his forehead. He wouldn't meet Kane's eyes. Crow watched that, satisfied. Your deputy's a good man with a weak spine. Weak spines bend to coin and fear. He did both. Crow twitched the lamp higher, its flame finding a tall, rectangular shine behind him. A mirror, court tall and rain-silvered, stood against the judge's wall, its glass freckled by age. In it, two Kanes faced off, like cards, laid side by side. Poetry, ain't it? Crow said. You fired at a mirror and learned nothing. Kane's jaw tightened. The first shot, the shattering burst as he'd rounded on his reflection in the boarding house, had been the same lesson twice. He had an enemy who knew his tells because the town already knew his legend. Crow leaned into it. Pike wet his lips. "Sheriff," he said, voice low. Later," Kane said, and the word cut like cold iron. He moved 2 steps forward. The boards groaned. The lamp hissed. The stink of old lye and mouse, gnawed paper rose like a graveyard smell. Crow cocked his head toward the Apache girl. "Choice of law, Sheriff," he said mildly. "Set the badge on the floor and toss the Colt into the box there, and maybe she walks out breathing. Keep them, and I let the steel speak." He tapped the chain. "This courthouse doesn't hear much these days. It'll hear her feet kick." The chain clinked, small and terrible. The girl's eyes found Kane's. They were steady. He could feel the badge under his fingers, warm from his chest. He remembered the grave of his boy and the wind that never stopped on the day they buried them. He remembered how law had been a coat too thin against that cold. "Law ain't always justice," Kane said softly, each word a weight. He hooked the badge from his vest, felt it spin once on his finger, silver wink like a falling star. "But justice rides with me." He set the star on the floorboards. The sound was the smallest sound in the world, and yet it filled the room. He holstered the Colt, halfway, then tossed it into the evidence box beneath the rail. The box thumped shut. Crow's smile deepened. "There he is," he murmured. "The man beyond the tin." Pike took an involuntary step backward. "You promised," he began. "I promised you'd live to see how it ends," Crow said without looking at him. "Stand by your judge there, son. We're writing the last page." Kane's hands hung open and empty, and for a heartbeat, Crow believed it. That was the beat Kane had wagered. He moved, not for a gun he'd surrendered, but for the room itself. The mirror made Crow taller than he was. The shadow on the floor made him honest. Kane stepped left, not toward the lamp, but toward the line where Crow's shadow broke against the rail. He kicked the lamp instead of shooting it, sent it skidding. Oil flashed across the plank and caught in a low woof of flame. The room fell into an amber dusk that turned men into outlines. Crow fired. The bullet chipped oak, spat splinters into Kane's cheek. Kane dove. A second shot ragged the sleeve of his duster. He slid on his shoulder behind the clerk's table, fingers closing on the ledger Pike had clutched like a child's Bible. It fell open to names, sums, and a crisp, official seal. Territorial Marshal Greeley, authorizing expedited adjudications, with Sheriff Kane's counterfeit signature stamped in wax. Pike saw it, flinched like a kicked dog. He said it was just paperwork. "Keys," Kane said. "Now." Pike fumbled at his belt. Through the ring, the keys skittered across the floor, slashing a bright line through ash. Crow's third shot rang. The keys chimed and spun. The girl kicked her chair, tipped herself sideways with a sharp curse to get her hands toward the ring. Her bonds shrieked softly as iron scraped wood. Kane rose into a crouch. Crow's silhouette shifted, gun high, the real man slightly inside his own reflection. Kane remembered the first mirror, the way his bullet had seemed to pass through an idea instead of flesh. Aim at what throws the shadow. He snatched the half-burned gavel from the clerk's desk and flung it at the judge's glass. The mirror fractured with a sound like ice, cracking on a winter river. Crow jerked at the same instant, reflex, not pain, and his shot went high, smashing the seal over the bench. Kane vaulted the rail. They hit like two storms colliding, forearms and fists, elbows and bone. Crow moved like a man who studied Kane's fights, the same way a hangman studies knots. He stepped inside the punch, used the scarred side as Leversters drove a knee into the ribs. They crashed against the bench. The ledger thumped to the floor, pages fanning like white birds. Kane tasted blood and pine dust. He let his left hand take the hurt, drove his right thumb into Crow's eye, then chopped for the wrist that held the Colt. The gun spilled, pearl grip flashing once before it vanished under the bench. "Snake," Kane hissed. Crow spat red and grinned anyway. "Mirror," he replied. Iron clinked. The girl had the key ring. She'd hooked a tooth of brass into the smallest lock and was worrying it, lips bloodless with effort. Pike saw her, saw redemption hanging on a hair, and then, at last, he made a choice. He lunged, boot sliding through oil, and yanked the chain up so she could work. Crow tore his gaze toward them. Kane drove his head forward. Skulls cracked. Both men saw stars. Outside, hoofbeats rattled the boards of the porch. Voices rose, men and matches and the brittle authority of Marshal Greeley. "By order of the territory," someone shouted. "No one leaves that building. Ropes ready." Crow laughed, the sound edged with madness. "Perfect," he breathed. "We'll let the law finish the story." He wrenched free and dove for the fallen Colt. Kane went low. His hand found not the gun, but an old length of iron, shackled chain, left like a thought of punishment, and he slung it up as Crow's weapon came level. The chain screamed through the air. It struck wrist and barrel. Bone cracked. The Colt fired wild, shot flaring the oil into a lashing tongue of fire along the floor. Heat slapped every face in the room. The girl's cuff sprang. She tore at the other, teeth bared. Pike shouted, "Sheriff, the ledger," under the deputy's seal. And then a bullet from outside punched through the shutter and took him in the back. He folded without a sound, ledger pages sticking to the blood that blossomed over his vest, as if the paper wanted to drink it. Kane and Crow circled in a tightening ring of heat. The mirror's shards showed a dozen Kanes moving in slices. Both had lost hats. Sweat furrowed dust into their hair. Crow fainted high, curled low, and drew a knife from his boot, mean and businesslike, the kind of blade that didn't care about names. "No witnesses," he murmured, and flicked it toward the girl. Kane moved without thinking. He caught the knife on his forearm. Skin opened. The pain was white and clean and bracing. He took a single step, closed the distance, and put Crow's wrist against the judge's rail so hard the old wood groaned. "You wore my face," Kane said, breath a rasp, "but you never wore my dead." He snapped the wrist against oak. The knife fell. He kicked it under. It skittered into fire, and vanished like a bad word. Outside the door, boards boomed under the weight of men. "Kane," Greeley's voice righteous and smug, "come out with your hands high. We got 30 who'll swear they saw you murder in cold blood. Gallows'll do the rest." The last lock gave. The girl slid free, hands shaking, eyes wet and bright in the heat. She snatched the keys and flung them to Kane. He didn't catch them. He didn't need to. He needed something else. On the floor by Pike's slack hand lay the silver badge Kane had dropped. It had skittered into blood and oil. Now it lay there like a coin on the bar of a crooked judge, asking for the kind of truth no oath could bind. Kane stared at it. So did Crow. "Pick it up," Crow whispered. Firelight made him a devil and a twin. "Pin it on. Walk out, Sheriff. Let the rope write your story. Or leave it, and you're an outlaw with my face. Either way, those people out there will hang a Kane tonight." Wind pressed through the broken shutters and made the courthouse sigh. The gallows rope creaked again, patient as a habit. Kane's fingers hovered over the star, his son's grave, his wife's locket, the boy in the jail 3 days ago who'd trusted the badge and gone free, the girl before him who would die if he misjudged by a heartbeat. He closed his hand. The door shattered. Marshal Greeley strode in with 6 rifles behind him and froze. 2 Kanes stood framed in firelight, one with a badge in his fist, one with blood on his grin. "Take him," Greeley barked. "Sheriff Kane." "Which one?" a rifleman whispered. Kane lifted the badge. Crow lifted his chin. The girl whispered, "Choose." And outside, the gallows rope swung as if someone had already stepped off the box. Gun smoke hung in the abandoned courthouse like a bad memory. Moonlight cut through the broken window and found the mirror Kane had shot to pieces. Shards glittered across the floorboards like frost on a grave. His breath rasped in the hush. Blood warmed his ribs where the doppelganger's bullet had grazed him, and the old building answered with a tired groan as if it, too, felt the weight of what they'd done. Rook, the man wearing Kane's face, lay propped against the judge's bench, hat knocked aside, dark hair slick with sweat. A shallow rise and fall said he was alive. The iron smell of blood said he wouldn't be for long if someone didn't act. Judge Pike. Authority starched into his collar, and sin stitched beneath it. Pressed a handkerchief to a shoulder wound, and glared up from the floor where Kane had kicked his pistol away. Outside, wind rattled the gallows beam. The rope creaked, speaking a word the town knew by heart. Kane holstered the Colt with the pearl handle and crossed the shards. Glass bit through the leather of his boots. He tore a strip from Pike's silk sash and bound Rook's arm, tight, efficient. "You ain't dying in my face," he said. His voice was a rasp of gravel and whiskey. Rook's lips twitched. "Never was your face, Sheriff. Just the mask they sold me." Pike found his bitterness. "You're wasting time. The town heard gunfire. They'll be here any minute to collect justice." Kane's steel-gray eyes went to the black mouth of the door. Lanterns bobbed beyond the square. Footfalls, a murmur brewing like thunder. He picked up his silver badge from where it had fallen in the fight and let it spin in his fingers until it flashed moon-white. He felt the weight of the choice before it settled back on his chest, a cold coin against a colder heart. "Law ain't always justice," he said softly, pinning the badge, "but justice rides with me." He hauled Pike up by the collar and shoved him to the wall, shackling one wrist to a cast-iron sconce, whose bolt had outlived 3 administrations. Another pair of cuffs clicked around Rook's good arm, and a floor ring, nooses, and shackles, all the tools of civilization laid out like communion. Kane's gaze fell to a broad, triangular shard beneath the bench. Behind the mirror's frame, where the glass had long hidden a cavity, pages waited, ledger sheets, letters, seals impressed in red wax. He slid them free with 2 fingers and fanned truth into the lamplight. Pike's scrawl crawled across the paper, payments to riders, witness tampering, orders to deploy the likeness, so Kane would take blame for fires, robberies, a boy's killing he had not stopped because the town had believed it was him. Rook swallowed. I took their coin to wear your hat, Sheriff. Then I took their fear because I didn't know how to do anything else. His eyes glistened, not with pleading but with something raw, too honest to fake. They had my woman locked in a back room, said she'd breathe easy when the rope sang your name. Guess I ain't brave without a script. Boot heels thudded on the porch outside. Someone tried the door, found it jammed. The crowd's tone sharpened, eager, mean. "Open up, Kane," a voice barked, breathless and righteous. "We aim to hang ourselves a judge and a devil twin, tonight." Kane stepped into the doorway, shotgun in one hand, the judge's ledger in the other. Lantern light washed him in amber. Dust floated like sparks in a smithy. "Ain't nobody hanging anybody," he said, calm as a winter creek, "not without reading what made you fools easy to herd." "You protecting a snake?" the blacksmith shouted, soot streaking his cheek. Move aside for a lynch rope and call it justice." Kane raised the papers. "These letters put Pike's hand on the rope you love. They name men you drink with and men you pray with. You hang him without reading, you'll hang blind. That what you want, Moses?" Silence hit the porch like a dropped anvil. Lanterns pitched in uncertain hands. Behind Kane, a floorboard whispered. He caught the shift in the reflection of a sliver of glass. Pike had drawn a derringer from his boot, a last trick for a last chance. Kane didn't turn. He pivoted the shotgun on instinct and fired once. The boom filled the courthouse, splinters jumping like fleas from the judge's bench. Pike's wrist slammed the wall, and the little gun clattered, dull as a bad penny. The judge screamed a thin, expensive sound. Kane stepped back into the room and kicked the derringer into a corner. "You just earned yourself breath enough to stand trial," he said, "and that's more grace than you offered anyone." Rook flinched at the shot and breathed shallow. "Let 'em hang me, Kane. Easier story for everyone." Kane looked down at the man with his own cheekbones and none of his years. In the shard beside Rook's hip, 2 Kanes stared up, one with a badge, one with blood on his teeth. He hated that the difference could be a paycheck and a lie. "You'll speak," the sheriff said. "Names, dates, who unlocked the jail the night old Eli died, who ordered the fire at Red Mary's. You'll say it before a judge that ain't Pike and a jury that ain't bought. Then you can ask God what happens next." "Much obliged," Rook whispered with a cracked laugh that wasn't a laugh. The crowd didn't disperse. It swayed. One voice rose. "Bring 'em out, Kane, or we come in." He answered with the ledger, reading names that made men shuffle and women hiss, and the hissed names made other men grab hands off rope, and rope made other men remember the weight of it around a friend's neck, and that memory took temperature out of the night. The gallows creak sounded lonely, almost embarrassed. From the back of the knot a rifle cracked. The bullet blew a chalky comet through plaster above Kane's shoulder. Pike ducked. Rook flinched. Kane spun and fired at the muzzle flash on the roof across the square. A scream tumbled down slate. A shape slid, knocked shingles as it fell, and hit hard behind the livery. He recognized the shooter in the lantern swing, Deputy Cobb McCrae, the turncoat his gut had named in Part 5 of this bloody sermon. Proof bled on the street under the impartial eyes of the town. Kane seized the moment. He hauled Pike by his shackled wrist, dragged him over glass. With his free hand, he hooked a fist under Rook's elbow. "On your feet," he said. "We're walking." They went out into a chorus of gasps. Kane held the shotgun low, the ledger high. He moved slow, forcing the town to see what it was doing, to see him, to see the truth in black ink and the fear it had married. The jail sat across from the gallows like a choice. The badge on his chest felt heavier with every step. "You sure, Sheriff?" the blacksmith murmured as Kane passed. "Ropes faster. Ropes forever," Kane replied. "So are wrongs." He put them in cells that still smelled of oil and cold iron. He turned the keys. The locks bit down with a clean mechanical honesty. He stood between bars and stared at each man until each looked away. Outside, dawn began to leak under the lid of night, thin as milk over coffee. Rook spoke first. "I'll testify, but it won't sew up your ghosts." Kane touched the badge. It spun once, twice, a quiet coin toss in the gray. His reflection wobbled in a shaving mirror on the far wall, fractured by hairline cracks that spidered through silver. His face traveled each line like a map of the choices he'd made. On the gallows, the rope stirred with the morning breeze, and then went still. Kane blew the lamp out and left the cells in blue light. Behind him, on the cot's iron frame, a shard of glass rolled and clicked to a stop, bright as a star that had fallen into a place too small to hold it. And in that stubborn glint, his own eyes, unchanged. Sun lifted the dust like old prayers, and Sheriff Kane walked the length of Maine with his hat brim low and his jaw set, listening to the town give itself permission to breathe. The judge would stand trial beyond the county, beneath a seal that couldn't be bought by Pike's money or sanctified by his Latin. Rook would speak, and every lie the town had swallowed would come back up bitter. That was the work ahead. But the mirror in the jail told a truth the papers never could. He had fired at himself and missed. He had dragged 2 men out from under a lynch mob and called that justice. Yet the guilt that lived behind his badge, his wife's dress stained on a floor he could never wash clean, his boy's laughter cut short by men he did kill too late, stayed where it always stayed. He could change a town's habits. He could not rewrite the dead. He thumbed the badge, felt its cold kiss on his fingers, and heard his own voice from years back, younger and meaner. Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me. Maybe that was all a man like him could promise, to keep riding, to keep choosing the harder thing, to be hated today so someone else lived tomorrow. He looked once more at the gallows, then turned his back on it and kept walking.